Jennifer Sness. You're watching News 24 Live. I'm joined in studio by author Hugh McMillan, who's going to introduce us to his new book, The Soccer Years. Hello.
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Now, my first question is, why release this book now?
That's a difficult question. I spent a lot of time in Swaziland and Zambia, not as a member of the ANC, but in close proximity to members of the ANC, and I knew a lot of people there. And when the exile period came to an end, around about 1990-91, I wrote a kind of a memoir about what I knew about the ANC, but then I thought it wasn't really publishable. And then I thought I was too close to the subject to be able to deal with it in an academic, impartial way. And it took me about 10 years, 12 years more before I began to think there's enough distance between me and that experience that I can approach it in an impartial academic way. And so then I started work around about 2008 on the archival research, interviews, but everything that I did is to some extent informed by the fact that I was there in Zambia, and I knew a lot of the people, and I had some kind of a feel for the experience of exile. So why release it now? Because it took me, whatever it was, 5 years to write, do the research, write, and get the book published.
Wow. Now, tell me about that experience. You say you know what the experience of exile feels like. What is that feeling?
Well, I think exile is very difficult. I've spent a lot of my life as an expatriate, which is to say a voluntary exile. But there's a huge difference between being a voluntary exile and an involuntary exile, and knowing that you can't go home, and that you don't know when you're going to go home. And I think exile was a very difficult experience for most people. Some people actually said it was positive, that they went to different places, they had different experiences, they learned about the world. But I think for most people, separation from family, separation from home, and the uncertainty, not knowing when they'd get home, if ever they'd get home, was very difficult. People in exile with the ANC always used to say, people would say, when do you think you'll get home? And they would always say, 5 years. But it was like a moving thing. Next year it was still 5 years.
Wow.
3 years later it was still 5 years. And even in 1988, 2 years before people actually went home, people weren't sure, they didn't know. Well, it was really only when the unbanning of the ANC was announced and Mandela was released that people knew more or less for certain that they could get home. Even then it took a year or two for some to get home.
Now, you said in your memoir you wrote, which you knew about the ANC. What did you write in that memoir?
That was very personal. That was about how I came into contact with the ANC, actually firstly in Swaziland, through people like Lindiwe Sisulu, now a member of the government, who was a student of ours in the university in Swaziland where I was teaching. I met Thabo Mbeki when he came as then quite a young person, we're talking about 1975, to start reorganizing the ANC underground inside South Africa, coming from Mozambique. So that's how I became associated with members of the ANC in exile. And then I moved on from Swaziland to Zambia in about 1978, and I spent a long time there. And an awful lot of my social life, intellectual life, political life was bound up with ANC exile. And I was privileged actually to know quite a lot of people who later became leaders of the new South Africa, who were then struggling to work to overthrow apartheid. Something it was a long, slow, difficult process.
What was it like for you as a white person to be in association with all of these people at that time?
I don't think I ever thought about it very much. I mean, the ANC, I think, always thought of itself as a non-racial, or at least by the time I came in contact with it, thought of itself as a non-racial organisation. And I don't think that, well, I'd like to think that race wasn't a huge issue. It never seemed to me to be a very big issue. There were always some people of different race groups involved with the ANC. But as I say, I was never a member. Don't get me wrong. I was never a member. I was like on the fringe of the ANC. I provided some sort of, with my wife, things like safe houses and some logistical support. Actually social support, because people in exile need sort of social support and encouragement, and that's something which people outside of the movement can provide. It's quite important, actually.
Now, the people who were in exile were sometimes seen as traitors, but they did contribute a lot to the struggle. Is this a true assessment of people who were in exile at that time?
You mean that some of the people who were in exile were working for the other side, or?
I think, from what I understand, if you were in exile, you were considered a traitor. You weren't here in the country.
Oh,
fighting
I see. Well,
struggle.
that's a different point of view. As somebody who lived outside, and so I never really thought of it that way. Yeah, so there were some people who have argued latterly that people in exile had an easy time, that they weren't suffering the full force and pressure of apartheid. But I can assure you that exile, I'm sure life inside South Africa wasn't easy, but life in exile wasn't easy either.
Now, you briefly touched on some of the challenges that faced people in exile, but tell us about that life that the people in exile were experiencing.
Well, I think there were an awful lot of difficulties, but the biggest one probably was uncertainty. Not really knowing how long you were going to be in exile, not really knowing, in the case of the ANC, whether it had the resources to support the growing number of people who it had to support. I always think, people are often very critical of the ANC in exile, but they don't often give it credit for the fact that it was like a welfare organisation, that it looked after people who were its members in exile, whether in Swaziland, whether in Zambia, wherever. It had to find accommodation, had to feed, clothe, educate, look after the health needs of a large population. That was something that was very difficult for it to do. So it was never an easy life. It was always difficult. Initially very difficult, but from about the mid-70s onwards, the ANC got more and more support from particularly Scandinavian sources, from Sweden, Norway, provided funds which helped them to maintain a growing population. But it was always difficult. The people who talk about a cushy life for the people in exile, I don't really buy that. There might have been a very few people at the top who spent time meeting people in hotels, and that was a rather rare, not many.
What are some of the misconceptions that people have about those in exile?
I think that's probably the biggest misconception, is this idea that people had a nice time, and that it was, a cushy life. I think that's probably the largest misconception. Well, the other big misconception, I suppose, is that people tend to say that anything that they don't like about the ANC and government now, or the last 10 years or whatever, is somehow the consequence of the exile experience, that the ANC learned bad habits or bad practices or something, which were brought back. The exile was a negative thing, and that some people brought back to South Africa bad habits and practices which they'd learned in exile. It's not something that I subscribe to. I don't really see that. And people talk about corruption in exile, but the fact is the ANC had very little in the way of resources. There was very little for people to be corrupt about. There's much more possibility for corruption if you're in government, and you're in a position to hand out contracts and things like that. There are temptations, but for people who were in exile, it wasn't like that. It was a struggle to survive.